Hello, my name is Eben Rose. I'm running for Maine State Senate, and I've been in my basement during this lockdown instead of canvassing because we have to recognize social distancing. And I've been making some signs. I don't know if and when these signs will go out, but I'm trying to run an art-filled and message-filled campaign involving signage and involving these vlogs. And I'm doing this as an alternative to sort of the standard candidate presentation of him or herself to you, the voters. Typically what those candidates express is some position or feeling about certain broad issues. I'm for the environment, or I'm all in favor of diversity and public transportation, and all that is very important and good for voters to know, so that when the people you vote for go to the legislature, you get a better idea of how they're going to vote when vote comes to them. But the big question I have is, where are those ideas, those bills coming from? And if your legislator isn't proposing to you some ideas of what legislation, what bills he or she might introduce, then probably they don't have any. And if they don't have any, that means that they're coming from somewhere else. They're coming from a lobby group, or they're coming from a special interest group that may or may not have the broad public interest in mind. So on these vlogs, I've been discussing some of the sort of philosophical or foundational tenets of one of the big pressing issues we have, and that is how to reinvent and rebuild our economy, which is still has yet to see its darkest times as a result of this pandemic. And what I'd like to do in today's vlog is take some of these fundamental concepts and congeal them into a very specific policy that can be used in other places besides Maine. If you just substitute one entity for another, you can see kind of how this works. But it sort of crystallizes some of those ideas that are so well baked into our political and economic structures, we don't even notice them. We don't even notice how much of a trickle-down system we have, and how much we have to change things in order to make it a truly people-centered and fundamental human needs-centered economy. So here we go. The topic is going to be something that I call electricity ratepayer equity. So here in this part of Maine, we have an investor-owned private utility called Central Maine Power. It's one of the lowest rated in terms of customer satisfaction in the nation. I think a recent survey even had it as the least liked public utility in the nation. So even lower than PG&E in California, which was found to be responsible for the fires of 2 years ago. So Central Maine Power is regulated by Public Utilities Commission, and they set pricing. So the two components of rate pricing are generation fees. So this would be the fees that the charge basically from people who are putting electricity into the grid, and then their part of it, which is the transmission and delivery costs. So that's the cost to them for setting up the wires and all the infrastructure that is the grid that we get the electricity delivered to our homes. So those two components comprise your by the kilowatt hour electricity rate as a resident in Maine. The Public Utilities Commission website has some statistics on its page that break down the number of users in different categories and the rates that they pay. That more detailed statistical breakdown is old. It's about 10 years old. It's from 2010, but it's the only numbers we have available to do the kinds of analysis that I'm going to share with you. There is an updated rate that we pay than the one I'm going to be using for this model. But I'm going to describe to you a model of how to make our rates more equitable and how to get out from the gridlock of top-down, trickle-down sort of payment of our decarbonized, hopeful future, and put the responsibility for that decarbonization more squarely in the laps of those entities that can afford it. So here's how this works. You ready? So there are three categories. Well, really there are four categories of transmission and delivery rates. The fourth category is for municipal street lights. So it's not a standard user. So I'll just set that aside for now. But that leaves three remaining categories of users. There are residential users, like most of us. There are small commercial users as a separate category that pay a different, slightly discounted rate. And then there are medium and large commercial and industrial users, which pay a much more heavily discounted rate. So those numbers are as follows. And this is from the 2010 full statistics. So the rates actually have gone up from this, but I'll just use this as a baseline to work out the whole program. So our rate for transmission and delivery as residences is 6.47 cents per kilowatt hour. Small commercial users pay a slightly discounted rate from that, a couple of cents per kilowatt hour. The large scale, medium and large scale commercial and industrial users pay, what is it? I have it written down here, 2.23 cents per kilowatt hour, 2.23 cents. So now, why is this? Why do large industrial and commercial users pay so much less per kilowatt hour than the rest of us? Well, the explanations are always pretty standard, and they would be, as follows. These are big users. These would be like paper mills, and like there's a couple of silicon chip manufacturers in South Portland, ON and Texas Instruments, and they use a lot of power. So the idea is, well, it doesn't take as much for us to, we're stringing basically one big wire to a user who's using a lot of power. And that's different from residential users who are multiple. They live multiple places out in the state, out in the sticks, out in the Jackman region or the Forks region or somewhere. So whenever there's a big snowstorm, it costs a lot of money to have all the utility trucks go out and restore service to these places out in the hinterlands. And not so much to go to one place, even though it may be a lot of power that goes through that place, it's still just one place. Okay, so that's one bit of logic that I've heard about this. But I want to take this to task a little bit and say, we here in South Portland, or Cape Elizabeth as the case may be, we are in a residential area of fairly dense population. There are multi-unit housing facilities here, and maybe even like across the river there are high-rise apartments, whole buildings that have multiple residences in them. And so a snowstorm comes, it doesn't take as much money, it doesn't cost as much in terms of resources for a truck to come and restore power to a whole city block or to a whole building, and all of those residences will get their service back online. Well, it turns out that all of those residences are paying exactly the same rate for transmission and delivery as, again, those people out there living in faraway places in Jackman where there's lots of lines going out there. So the idea is all us residences are all paying the same rate. We're all pooled, even though if you break it down, some residences and locations are much easier to maintain and much less expensive to maintain than others. But that's okay. That's just pooled risk, right? Or pooled cost. So I guess the question is, why should commercial be any different? And what would happen if we all paid the same transmission and delivery rates? So let's pretend we made that change, that the transmission and delivery rates per kilowatt hour, that everyone paid 6.47 cents. This is what would happen. Now, I know you're eager to hear this breakdown, but I want to give you just a little bit of a preface before then. And I want to share with you a number, and that number is 3,500, or 3,500. That is an important number, or a good benchmark number, because that is about the global average of kilowatt hours used any year for energy use, right? 3,500 kilowatt hours is the average global use of energy per year, per household. Now, that includes poor places in the world that don't use a lot of electricity and big profligate users like the United States. But it would be helpful to know that Germany also, at least according to several sources, uses about this same amount, around 3,500 kilowatt hours per year per household. Now, how is Germany, which is a first world nation and fully capable of enjoying all of the technological wonders of comfort that we enjoy here in the United States. And they live in a climate that is like Maine. It's cloudy much of the time, rainy, snowy, northern climate, so the winter sun is more restricted even than here. But they're able to pull this off. Why? Back in the 1990s, there was a series of laws that were adopted by the German Parliament that were collectively called the Energiewende, or energy turning point, or energy revolution, or transformation. And this series of laws included such things as a feed-in tariff. And a feed-in tariff is sort of like net metering is for Maine and for other states. It's where those generators who contribute electricity to the grid that are using carbon source fuels, fossil fuels basically, have to pay an extra tariff. And the money that goes from that tariff, or that's collected from that tariff, is used to offset the cost for generators who are contributing electricity to the grid who are not using carbon-based. So this allows homes, for example, small residences or commercial sites to have an incentive to generate electricity beyond their need using solar and wind. And so this energizes the grid and gives built-in incentives to get away from fossil fuel and towards these renewable energy sources. So that's the Energiewende in Germany, and that's how they were able to pull it off. And part of it was establishing a system so that there was greater efficiency in home energy usage. And they are inventive people, as we all well know, and have a number of energy-saving innovations, devices in the home that prevent, say, energy loss through, rechargers that are plugged in all the time, or inefficient refrigerators. And until we get that sort of efficiency adopted into our lifestyle, we will always have this energy gap that I had mentioned in a previous vlog. The energy gap is the amount of anticipated energy use based on our current lifestyle and current growth expectations, and the amount of electricity that can supply that demand. And right now, the United States and Canada are very different than the world and Germany in consuming upwards of 11,000 kilowatt hours per year per household. So until we get to a point where we can have an incentive to use less electricity and be more, just on a day-to-day level, more conscientious about our energy use, then we will continue to have this energy gap and continue to be looking for alternatives, I guess, to fossil fuels that are not themselves entirely savory, like damming huge areas and causing all kinds of environmental disruptions from big impoundments for hydroelectric, or worse yet, expecting nuclear power to fill in this gap with all of its attendant environmental problems. So that's where we want to get to. We want to get to 3,500 kilowatt hours of usage per household per year. So how can we do that? How can we go about doing that? So this is where this ratepayer equity little experiment can go on. If we all paid 6.47 cents per kilowatt hour, then the amount of revenue that would be generated from the excess amount, or the extra amount, the higher charge that the category of large commercial and industrial users, they would be paying, well, a little over twice as much, right? And so that would be an increase in the amount of revenue. So let's just say that the revenue is the same, that we'll keep the revenue expectations the same, regardless of the internal price structuring. And instead of having residents pay for the bulk of this revenue, you have it equitable, so that residences and large-scale commercial and industrial users all pay the same rate. Well, what happens is that surplus, that excess revenue, it can be used for various things. One of the things is it can be used to offset the cost of electricity, of transmission and delivery for residential users. One way that this could work is you could have 3,500 kilowatt hour entitlement to all residential users within the CMP, Central Maine Power customer base. They could be entitled to 3,500 kilowatt hours of use per year for free. And discounting that amount of revenue, even still, leaves $83 million of excess surplus or excess revenue for Central Maine Power. $83 million can go a really long ways towards subsidizing or helping build personal solar arrays, towards helping even commercial users go green. This is not a small amount of change. And all this comes from just having fair and equitable rates. So fair and equitable rates is a way we can go about achieving something akin to the Energiewende policies that Germany had. Now, I can hear the hue and cry and objections from some of these commercial users already. And they will say what they always say, are you kidding? You're going to increase our operational costs. Well, we'll just transfer that. We'll just have to flow that through to our customers, right? Now, this is what I've mentioned before in one of these vlogs before, the pass-through costs. And what I mentioned before in one of these previous vlogs is every time you hear this pass-through costs, you have to put all of their operational costs on the table and say, really? So let's say one of these large commercial and industrial users locally here, Texas Instruments, okay? I have no real beef with Texas Instruments. There's a lot of talent there. There's a lot of engineering talent right there in our local chip manufacturing plant. That facility is top-notch, state-of-the-art. Now, that kind of engineering talent could very much be used to help us solve some of our environmental problems. I realize that they're in a market, they're in competition with Samsung and other chip manufacturers. But what do they do? What do they actually make that is of such great importance for the Earth? My understanding is that they make computer chips that are helping aid in the control devices for cars and help our cars be, I guess, more efficient, maybe smarter. Maybe they help contribute to the surveillance capitalism that is so much a problem. That surveillance capitalism, by the way, is that tendency for your car to know your consumer choices, your driving habits, and not just adjust them for you, but use that rich data to sell to commercial interests, preying on your behavior and maybe even altering your behavior so that you are more likely to go through foot traffic or road traffic, as it were, to near where they're selling things. So that's surveillance capitalism. Anyway, there is a great talent pool at Texas Instruments that could definitely be used to help solve one of the big problems that they have, and that is how much energy they use, that is ultimately fossil fuel generated energy. So would it be too much to ask for them to apply some of their talents towards making their own facility completely fossil fuel free? And if they did, then they could generate their own power and not pay any transmission and delivery costs at all. So much for complaining about the equitable rates, right? If you're making your own electricity, then you don't have to complain about what you're paying because you won't be paying anyone. So why don't they do this? Why don't they invent such a technology for their own facility locally? Well, they'll say, yeah, this is an extraneous purchase. Why would we want to do that? It's going to cost us too much. We have a bottom line we need to maintain. Well, here's part of their bottom line. The CEO of Texas Instruments is a bachelor's prepared electrical engineer, worked his way up. He makes, $17.2 million a year? $17.2 million every year he makes as salary. Most of that is in equities, as is the case with many of these CEOs. But that's still, I think, a little over half of his profile is in equities. But honestly, $17.2 million, even half of that, $8 million, or even if it's half of that, $4 million, is a lot of money per year. And if some of that money, just 1 year's worth of salary and compensation, was used converting Texas Instruments facility to its own electricity use, then we would be much farther along in our efforts to go green generally. Now, that kind of talent can definitely be trickled down. We could all benefit from any sort of innovation that they come up with at Texas Instruments to make their facility green. That's the kind of private capital, the talent, that needs to be expressed towards this effort. One of my little slogans is Now is the time for all good talent to come to the aid of the planet. There's a lot of good talent at Texas Instruments, and that talent needs to be applied towards this project because this is the whole Earth that's in jeopardy. So big deal. We're asking you to pay your fair share in transmission and delivery costs. So that's it. That's a little quick and dirty explanation of how ratepayer equity can be used to move us in a very solid way, in a very committed way, towards the kinds of energy use that we need. And I would love to bring something like this to Augusta and maybe be the first in the nation to try this. So one other thing I need to mention is the excuse that Texas Instruments will use, and any of these folks will use, and that's to say, well, you know, if you increase our operational costs, we're just going to pull up stakes and go elsewhere. So I just want to pause and say, this is a very standard, and it's, you know, not to be taken lightly, this is a very standard expectation. It pits states against states, locations against locations. This is embedded in the not so savory part of the term competition. We need to be competitive. And I just got to say, this is going to kill us in the end. This race to the bottom, this competition for the lowest bidder. Oh, well, we don't have any labor standards in our state, so come over here. Oh, we don't have any environmental standards in our state, so come over here. Oh, well, we're going to give you a big tax break so we can all subsidize you, so come over here. I would argue two things. To bring industry or to bring talent to the state of Maine, we just need to offer a good life for the people who work for those industries. Those are the kinds of industries we want. Maine's got a lot to offer. It's got great scenery. It's got a good climate. It's got good people. And, you know, it's not some big congested city. And the more we can focus in developing quality of life here on Maine as a guarantee, all the aspects of quality of life, all those fundamental human needs and supporting them, then people are going to want to come here because what else is there? You know, yeah, sure, you could go live in Kansas where it's flat, boring, and tax-free, and that's not working out so well. So, or you can come to where the life is good. And if I was an engineer, I would much rather live in Maine than Kansas. I mean, I'm not an engineer. I'm a scientist. And I'm living in Maine and not Kansas. So there we go. Yeah, so in any case, you know, the jobs that are going to be pulled up, and if the firm leaves the state, I just want to push back a little bit and say, they've invested a lot in, all of these big industries have invested a lot to be here. They have some facilities that are not cheap. They're very expensive to build these facilities. And yeah, sure, they could opt to go somewhere else. They could opt to shutter this establishment and go somewhere else where labor is cheaper, where the environmental laws aren't so annoying to them, where electricity rates are the cheapest. Yeah, they could do that. Honestly, the state can be and should position itself to be ready for that. It should be ready to be able to have the funds to buy out certain contracts, to buy out the facility. Let's keep in mind that Texas Instrument facility, if it's abandoned by Texas Instruments, it might have a difficult time finding a buyer. I mean, if it's that onerous to live and work in Maine, to have an operation in Maine, then nobody's going to want to be here, right? Not friendly to business? Sure, just say that, right? Not friendly to business. It's friendly to the people who work for those businesses. Businesses have to be friendly to humanity. That is their obligation. So let's forget the business-friendly part and talk about whether this is actually good for the planet. That's the higher priority, isn't it? So here it would be. A facility that would be abandoned, that would be a brownfield site, and that would be a problem that the state should not bear. The industry should be bearing the cost of cleanup. So this is all part of the cost. So, you know, once an industry invests in a state, it had better invest for the right reasons, and when it decides to divest from a state, it better divest for the right reasons. If nothing else that this pandemic has taught us is that our future is not going to be dictated by markets. Our future is going to be dictated by nature. It's going to be dictated by the series of crises that we are already facing right now with this pandemic and that is completely collapsing economies around the world. It's going to be a future that is about other pandemics, about other natural catastrophes that are likewise going to show how non-resilient our economy is. We're smart people. We're inventive people. We have a great deal of skill and experience in developing tools and technology to help us. This is the help we need, is the help in solving our climate and carbon use problems. So if the $17.2 million salary Texas Instruments engineer CEO doesn't have that interest in mind, well, it's about time he started getting that interest in mind. So that's the trickle down we need. So that was my quick and dirty analysis of ratepayer equity and how it fits into the bigger picture of climate justice and electricity fairness, I guess I would say. I think the idea of making this energy transition is both a technical one and a social problem. So the technical one and social both converge in this idea of ratepayer equity. So that's the kind of thinking that I think I can bring to Augusta. And if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to visit my website at ebenrose.com, see some of the other policy ideas I have there. I'm a clean elections candidate, and I would very much appreciate your $5 contribution so that I am clean elections eligible. I need to make 175 such individual donations from those within the district. That would include Cape Elizabeth, a little slice of Scarborough around Higgins Beach, and all of South Portland. So please consider contributing, and I thank you for that. And these messages can continue. Thank you. Be safe, be well. Good night. Take care.